the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce this week's guest, consider tossing us $1 a month at www.patreon.com/MUHH. This week, we are proud to bring to you Professor Gary Genosko, who many of you may know for his critical works on Baudrillard and Félix Guattari, as well as his work on semiotics, information theory, and communication theory. So much of our friends and mutuals and listeners will already know of your work, but we'll kind of give them the rundown. I feel like you need no introduction in my view, but you know, obviously, what I was saying before we started was basically I am fascinated to know we can talk first about how you got into Baudrillard or what was it about your studies in grad school that brought you towards some of the recurring themes in your work, like the question of information, communication, specifically these thinkers that put linguistics to task or submit it to some scrutiny. You know, you can see kind of the allies you mobilize in this fight against what Guattari himself calls, you know, the imperialism of linguistics.
I came at it through the conjunction of semiotics and psychoanalysis. That was one of my preferred routes, first of all. And that was based upon the opportunities that I had from the time I was an undergraduate into my sort of early graduate school years, just to attend these summer institutes on semiotic and structural studies. And I was fascinated with semiotic problems. During that period, that would have been early 1980s, so the first half of the 1980s. And then later on, when I became much more conversant with psychoanalysis, having studied extensively in sort of later grad school, Freud and Lacan, etc., the two together were, you know, an obvious Guattarian hybrid. And you could see that in everything that he wrote. He's trying to work through the European reception of semiotics via Gemslev and the problems that he encountered clinically and theoretically vis-a-vis the anti-psychiatry movement. What was the relationship between institutional psychotherapy and anti-psychiatry? You know, he was more of an anti-psychiatrist than, you know, because he was not impressed with some of the British experiments in this area, R.D. Laing and others. Although he did like, you know, David Cooper, some of the things that Cooper did. The psychoanalytic critique in Anti-Oedipus, which is, you know, less anti and more of a kind of sideways shift, also fascinated me because I, you know, studying for years and years Freudian psychoanalysis, you know, sort of embeds you in that thought, and the combination of a Peircean, Gemslevian style of semiotics, not so much a linguistic structuralism, but that was always in the semiotic, you know, field that you had to reckon with. So you always had, Guattari was a great, someone to travel with, a great fellow traveler, because he always looked askance at linguistic structuralism and the imperialism of linguistics and the critique of all forms of structuralist thought, especially schools of structuralism and followership. This started for him a kind of critique of scientificity and the performance of science, the wearing of lab coats and the titling of conferences, scientific conference on X. So that was also very much in the spirit I was working in as a philosopher, someone trained in philosophy and environmental studies. Now, the other route, which is equally, I think, interesting, is ecosophy. Except during that period in the 1980s, the only one using the term was Arne Næss, and
Right.
Norwegian philosopher, originally a philosopher of language, but then he comes over to this view of self, expanded self in the environmental field, and develops this concept of ecosophy, which Guattari picks up, but never attributes to him, as far as I'm aware, never attributes to him. And it's almost as if when you're reading in the late 80s, Guattari, you think, ecosophy, where does this come from? Well, obviously, it's Næss's term. He used it all through the decade. But there's never a real engagement. And I think that I've spoken about this in various spots over the years. And I don't know if there's really a productive outcome of that. Whether the dialogue is even possible, I doubt very much, because of the really, really different concepts of subjectivity at play in those two different thinkers. And yet you have, of course, so those are my preferred routes. But even before that, if you can tolerate yet another.
No, I love it. Please.
If you add a tributary to these two rivers, it was, of course, Baudrillard. And Baudrillard offered a rigorous critique of the sign. His anti-semiology was very highly tuned and developed. I became fascinated with that. And Symbolic Exchange and Death, for me, was the key. Libidinal Economy, Symbolic Exchange and Death, Anti-Oedipus, those are key books for me in my intellectual formation.
Awesome.
Especially the anthropological material in Symbolic Exchange and Death, which I spent a lot of time working on when I was writing my dissertation.
Oh, that's amazing.
So of course, so I mean, this is kind of an odd set of interests.
Right.
They're certainly not core disciplinary interests by any stretch of the imagination. So I was always a bit of a marginal character within the sort of disciplinary spectrum.
It's that kind of transdisciplinary spirit that does show a fidelity to, you could say Guattari's vision or his own attempts to carve out these spaces that didn't pre-exist. Other than, as I kind of said, you've already shown a short genealogy or a short, history of how you approach these topics, and now makes sense much more clearly with your chapter on anti-semiology, your second chapter in the critical semiotics book, that now I see clearly the connections between Baudrillard and Guattari, which beforehand I had only seen glimpses of. You mentioned Anti-Oedipus, Libidinal Economy, and then Symbolic Exchange and Death. And Cooper and I have been kind of circulating around these works, thinking of, it doesn't have to be necessarily direct influence, but there is a chronology, and there is an interplay of, there's a dialogue going on. For example, in your chapter on Baudrillard, you don't go easy on him when you cite from Libidinal Economy, from Lyotard, who is rather, if not rude or even kind of libelous in a certain way. He does call Baudrillard kind of like a fellow brother, but at the same time, he's not holding back in his estimation.
Well, I mean, think how long it took for sort of the European left to accept Baudrillard into their ranks. It was only really, Bifo and Lazzarato and others took them almost up until 2018 to admit that, Baudrillard has some very interesting ideas, some prescient ideas about credit and debt, and that simulation became a key to understanding the digital world, and that the divide was Symbolic Exchange and Death. The divide, they thought of it as a reactionary text. And if you read it in terms of his vision of the anthropological precursor to the semiotic regime, then you can understand how some of those ideas would, marginalize him politically, even though he was moving in the same circles during his younger years.
Right.
Politically.
What Cooper and I keep trying to articulate, and you put really well, is this notion that you could say it's just this work, but I know there's other works that you cite where it's not just a question of nihilism, because I do get the feeling from Baudrillard, as I've tried to describe it, is whether there's a nostalgia, although he kind of relegates that to an impossibility, but there is this nihilism. But you put it very well, where you're saying it's a certain way of going past nihilism and even going beyond it and through it, maybe, and taking it further. And I wonder if that is part of the unpalatableness for the left in Baudrillard's work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that raises some eyebrows, to say the least. It raises some questions for them about the consequences of this particular move. And in Baudrillard, the moves are so tightly scripted that he doesn't often present a very heterogenetic picture. For instance, in the critique of semiology, it's just semiology.
Right.
And in contrast to the symbolic, there isn't a kind of broader introduction of Gemslev or Peirce, or know, even Umberto Eco does that.
There you go. Yeah.
And Eco moves is very much closer to Guattari in that sense, that those source materials are for him very significant, but never in Baudrillard, never, that sort of ecumenical spirit isn't there.
Right. It does seem his mobilization, as you pointed out, the anthropological core of symbolic exchange of death, with his relation to Maus and the gift and the counter gift. Right. Absolutely
crucial. And the African material that he borrows from Jolin and the Chad, Sarah people in Chad, and the rituals, the importance of rituals and coming of age rituals in particular, and the way in which this is, in a sense, enacted through these special objects.
Right.
The boulette, meat and mud ball. For him, this is an alternative world.
Right.
Anti-capital, anti-semiotic, anti-semiological, anti-capital, whatever, call it what you like. But that's for him. But it's also a very poetic anthropology, an anthropology that's no longer in the field, that no longer has any connection to the field, because he always, he leaves you wondering, like, well, why would anyone actually respond to the counter gift, or who would receive the counter gift? Which corporation could possibly receive a counter gift of death? Until decades later, he figures out, so 9/11 is the embodiment of this counter gift of death.
Right. I mean, it is. He does say right out in that first chapter, he ends it, if I remember correctly, by kind of suggesting it's sort of my immediate death that could be this counter gift, or this gift that couldn't be reciprocated, and thereby sort of destabilize the structure. And that, I choose not to read that as a direct nihilistic statement that we should all just be lemmings and jump off. But I don't, he doesn't really, it's imaginative, and it's provocative.
He's anticipating the logic of terrorism. I mean, that's
that's
really astute vision to see how that, just as neoliberalism is really shifting into gear, that's just, I think, incredible insight.
He does work that out early on in some of the books. I can't remember which one it is now, and I recall even giving a paper on precisely this topic at a conference when I was a graduate student, trying to show that he had anticipated some of these issues. And he was marvelous in his capacity to predict and to follow trends in that respect. But it is nihilistic to offer a kind of death as a solution.
Right.
A fundamental social solution, because it is not normal to be dead in our society. And yet in some societies, it is normal to be dead and to communicate with the dead.
Right.
When we say death, this is not nihilism at all.
Right.
For him, this is something more profound, something non-Western that he's trying to access and to integrate into a sort of critical understanding of how do you resist the code, societies of simulation and the code. This is a solution. To the extent that it's applicable, well, probably it never was applicable, but theoretically it is a solution.
Right.
To the problem he poses.
Is it as simple as saying that's his version of a kind of death drive, maybe the death drive of symbolic exchange? Or is that just now we're just using, obviously the death drive gets used broad ways, and I'm kind of anticipating here a little bit, because I do want to get your thoughts on Guattari's kind of shift of the notion of death drive, especially when it comes to institutions.
To the extent that he even retains an idea of a death drive, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
Because the source material for this is very different. I mean, there is the whole unpacking of psychoanalysis in symbolic exchange and death, but that will take us very far afield. If we stick to the anthropological content and we can see sort of what the point is, to be more most than most. Right, to read most against most, to be more Mosian than most could ever possibly be, and to be so attached to this idea of the circulation, as the circulation and the reciprocity must take precedence over all else.
Right.
And yet, how do you provoke a society that's not interested in reciprocity to receive the gift of death? For him, this is a fundamental problem. I should say that this is, in a way, his anthropological training arose in some ways during his visits to the US in the late 60s and early 70s, when he was attending conferences about design and also sitting in on a few lectures, anthropology lectures, that he was really interested in. I mean, it's fascinating. There's a whole tradition of theories of the gift, and I used to teach a grad course on this subject, from Most to Derrida. Theories of the gift. It was one of my absolute favorite courses to teach. Absolutely wonderful material. That's a long, that, in a way, it's a detour, but it's all part of my formation. I mean, what happens to you when you teach in sociology departments is that you tend to teach, sort of quasi-orthodox.
Right.
So you're not standing outside the batter's box all the time. You have at least one foot in there.
Even in psychoanalysis, it's not the same lineage, but you do kind of have a theory of gifts, whether it be, sort of yielding jouissance to the big other, or the childhood theories of sexuality, of sort of giving the child to the parent figure with the feces. You can see some resonances there, but obviously it's in a totally different register. I always wondered about Baudrillard, his use of psychoanalytic concepts, especially in this early work, like in the critique of the political economy of the sign, and in symbolic exchange and death. I always wondered about, is it perhaps because of the centrality, or the seeming centrality of Lacan and structuralism, that he has to become, or psychoanalysis, as you kind of pointed out earlier, right? It's central, at least in Europe, the European reception of structuralism. Is that kind of why it has to be dealt with by Baudrillard? I
think his root is even stranger. I mean, he's a Germanist, right? He's a Germanist by training, and he's translating plays, a lot of plays and whatnot, into French from German, and that's how he gets his start, in a way, in publishing. And then he moves into this consumer society is the topic that animates his early theoretical production. And he wants to understand semiotically, what the meaning of an object is and how consumption can be described quite anthropologically from the very start, but semiologically and anthropologically. Those are the key moments for him. But how he gets from this Germanism to consumer society via Lefebvre, I suppose, is anyone's guess. I don't know the whole precise story. I mean, no one's written a book about this yet.
Hey, opportunity for
the listeners out there, start.
That's a project I should work on, honestly.
We have every possible angle on Foucault known to the world, but we have nothing really comparable in Baudrillard. And we have massive studies of Deleuze and Guattari and their lives. And so forth. We have nothing like that in Baudrillard. I think it'd be quite worthwhile for those who knew him in his younger days, especially. Not myself. I came a bit later. I was of the generation. I was just exchanging a few messages with Bill Bogard, who was a kind of early adopter of Baudrillard in Baudrillard studies, and we said, we all remember the first conference at Missoula, Montana, the University of Montana, on Baudrillard in the U.S. And I was still a graduate student in 89. Wow. So we were exchanging notes. Do you remember this? Do you remember that? Eugene Chadbourne played his electrified rake, and Baudrillard was bored.
Oh, that's too bad.
We could not impress him. The organizers took him to view a hole in the ground, that had opened up a giant pit.
Okay.
That opened up in Butte. He was whatever. Is this American excess? I don't know.
Wow.
It was an
Amazing.
interesting moment. But yeah, I was studying pataphysics in Baudrillard. I wanted to know, how in his kind of intellectual formation, how pataphysics in his, in a sense, high school formation, how influential this was. And it was extremely important to him. Alfred Jarry and the figure of Ubu, and pataphysics as, as far beyond metaphysics as metaphysics is beyond physics. And, Deleuze, again, comes back to pataphysics, to Mach, Heidegger, and, so it's an important thread that we don't have that kind of thread in our intellectual training. We don't have that ribald, ferocious,
Right.
parodic encounter with thought.
I love the thread that you made with bringing up his pataphysics and the plays he translated, right? Because I think that that's a thread, that literary background that, as you said, could be a source of interest. But I guess that, would you say if there is, connecting Baudrillard and someone like Félix Guattari, you spent countless pages in books sort of making it clear that he merits attention on his own. Is it in anti-semiology, this notion of sort of taking linguistics to task? Because Baudrillard himself doesn't really give much thought to the asignifying.
No, not at all. And I think that, that is, in asignification is the symbolic exchange for Baudrillard.
Interesting.
And for Guattari, this is a whole other dimension of how, things like algorithms enunciate machines, how your magnetic stripe on your credit card enunciates a process of verification and so forth, and the movement of information, that proto-enunciativity is a very interesting feature of this it's almost an animistic principle, that the proto-enunciative machine is the asignifying semiotics in Guattari, and that is completely original. And I think that the informational examples, that's why in one way I gravitate towards them, as they make sense to me and when I'm trying to think through, but also this kind of provocative title that I gave in Critical Semiotics, the search for non-meaning. The search for non-meaning is, of course, a critique of the famous phenomenological psychiatry books, The Search for Meaning, Man's Sick Search for Meaning, the obsession that semiotics has with meaning. What about non-meaning? What about the lower level of semiotics? What about signals?
Some of your polemic, if you will, a little bit to, if I'm correct, it's against situating the signalectic at the lower stratum.
Absolutely.
And I think that's very much, I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this, but I think that's very much in line with Guattari's own types of polemics where, situating sort of the abstract to the concrete in this kind of hierarchy, or these other types of hierarchies of signs and non-signs and all that just doesn't quite accord with his vision.
Yeah, I think that's just a residue of a semiotic hierarchization of signs that is never critically addressed, and that signals are always the poor cousins of, as it were, of all other sign types. And the reason that they have no psychical dimension. They have no, at the top of the pyramid, they have nothing. They don't need it.
Right.
And this, Guattari says, is actually a virtue.
Right.
This shows us that a different kind of connectivity is at work here, and we should attend to it, because asignification is, in a way, the future of machinic interfaces, that as we displace more and more the human from these processes, or at least have the human adjacent or subjacent to them, the subjectivity subjacent or adjacent to them, we don't need to follow that search for meaningfulness in the same way that the tradition has diagrammed it, in a way.
Right.
Saussure and, even Ogden and Richards, to go back to the 50s.
Even Peirce, you point out throughout your work, this is another refrain. I'm trying to pull out some refrains from your work that you've isolated that have really helped to illuminate things for my own study is this notion that Guattari also revalorizes the diagram against Peirce, who wants to kind of subsume it under the icon and relegate it to perhaps more mathematical representations, visual representations, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And he does this. He does that in a number of ways, very interesting ways. He does the same thing with Gemslev, right? He's going to, he's well schooled in these thinkers, and he's going to read them against themselves to a certain degree and extract from them things that he needs to create this asignifying universe that he wants to populate with diagrams and so on. The reversibility of expression and content. And he wants to take just certain, because, in Gemslev, there's still a linguistic imperialism in there. And if you let it loose, if you let it out of its box, it will take its revenge on you. But Guattari says, no, we're not having any of that. That's not what we want. The same with Peirce. It's not that we're going to be beholden in any way to the categories that he generates. We're going to extract from them this particular idea that we want to be generative, forward-looking, always becoming, unfinished in a way. In Peirce, there is that element, but it's always beholden to the categories.
Is it that Peirce is still searching for meaning in a certain way? I mean, is that still one of the ancillary goals, and perhaps?
Yes, because he wants to, at the end of the day, be able to say that in the community there are solutions to meaning, and we all agree in the end about something. Right. But the teleological thought in this regard leads us to that point. But in Guattari, we never get a sense that dissensus is always going to be more important.
Right.
Deviation, aberration, lines of flight, escape points, escape hatches, all those are going to trump, as it were, any teleological conclusion.
I love that you say that, because that is what you find again in something like Three Ecologies and Chaosmosis and the ecosophical turn, which is this notion of cultivating dissensus. It's also, you find it in Deleuze, right, where it's this critique of good sense and common sense. The whole notion that everybody knows, and perhaps we actually need the transcendental idiot to ask the obvious questions that, what does everybody know? How is it that we all share this knowledge, this consensus that sort of, presumes that we fit in, and that everything, as you said, is teleologically geared towards some higher goal.
All of these matters come right down to the practice of borrowing concepts, working on them, changing them, recalibrating them, and reinserting them into different systems of thought. And it is sort of a fundamental activity for any theorist. I mean, it's the way in which you generate what I used to call in the old days textual operators, as it were. How do you get something, to perform certain roles or tasks for you in your text?
Right.
The way in which Derrida would operationalize these very simple ideas and put them to work, and then follow them through all of these different texts to see what damage they could do.
I think this is an aspect of Lacan that Guattari adopts, or at least that's my kind of take on it. But I wanted to go back, Gary, to the asignifying, just because when you mentioned the credit card, the magnetic strip, and all of that, the first thing I thought of was blockchain, because blockchain technology is sort of removing the human from the process of, like you said, there's no other outside authority, like a state or whatever, to direct the completion of the contract or whatever the key sort of that's going on in that blockchain, whatever that is. I don't understand the technology that well, but I think conceptually, this is something that I had thought about relative to Maus as well, and the gift. And in terms of that reciprocity of contract and counter gift, or along those lines, because the technology itself is what renders reciprocity. There's no escape from that reciprocity in that way. But these are just some kind of fleeting thoughts.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about some more advanced examples that's sort of a little bit beyond where I've come, because it's not obvious to me that the human ever leaves the scene, ever flees the scene. And there's always, some residue, or there's some intersection that's just maybe not obvious with what we would call a human. I mean, I don't want to overemphasize the information tech. side of things. And
Sure.
so I'll slightly resistant. I like a slightly older fashioned idea, like a magnetic stripe, which is almost at the end of its life, right? I think that we won't have that soon. That will be all over with.
Right.
And Guattari doesn't start there. He says, oh, what about the signature when you go into the bank and you sign a little sheet of paper and that sets into motion the signature. So he's gone from a kind of analog example to a not digital, but kind of proto-digital, a trigger mechanism, right? Something that triggers a digital process that are digitally linked. And blockchain is the sort of end of that. You can extend, but you can also say there's something else that he's trying to get at, that it's not just information technology, that this is happening in the earth. This is happening when you recycle your vegetables from your kitchen. You're creating this transformation, this asignifying transformation chemically. And this to him is another example that's just as rich.
Right. Yes.
No pun intended. but just as viable. And I know that Taylor is obviously remembering this section from the Machinic Unconscious. I often quote it. It's a great section about the breakdown of vegetable matter into earth and the movement through that earth of worms and proteins and minerals and all of those transformations, those signals, asignifying. That's an asignifying universe he's inhabiting, well below the information tech threshold.
Right.
I love how you do point out this move towards, whether it be a metaphor or just a kind of a method of working out the implications, this notion of a soil science and of what you call a humification. And you do quote that, I don't know, provocative. It's provocative imagistically, this notion that the asignifying and asubjective components sort of proliferate off of the manure of signifying components and subjective components. Guattari gives us this image of, as you said, this kind of recycling and this kind of composting.
Yes, absolutely. It's another way into asignification, which is difficult enough to explain to anyone who has discovered that, actually, the entire history of semiology that I have just learned is now thrown into the wastebasket because there are no psychical, there's no meaning, there's no psychical dimension, there's no signified that's significant, and this throws into crisis a lot of semiotics.
And it's, as Guattari calls it, it's imperialism, and it's obviously one of the things that Guattari is concerned about is the way in which linguistics it's not just the imperialism of the despotic signifier, right, which is a figure that at least stems back to Anti-Oedipus, if not even further back to Guattari's own writings on Lacan, but this notion of sort of hiding or dissimulating power. Again, this goes back to everybody knows and the common sense, but he has that. I love that footnote about Chomsky's S is a marker of power and not.
Yes, exactly. That the medieval, this is a medieval concept of the tree that inhabits logic. Umberto Eco is very good on this. He would give you a history of trees, logical trees, and right up to, you could go take it right up to Chomsky from medieval logic to Chomsky's linguistics. And you could say that, yes, this is going to be subject to a critique. It's very interesting for me to think about someone who listened to those kinds of lectures from Umberto and sort of followed medieval thought in my philosophical training and became fascinated with kind of early semiotics and how semiotics and logic were always close together, right up to Peirce, in fact. Right. So those are, for me, key reference points.
I love the examples that you give, and obviously we could talk about all kinds of other technology, because one of the things that I would jump to from here is, now I'm not sure if you got this directly from Reza Negarestani, but you do develop this notion of a kind of, I'm not sure if you call it a machinic dust or if you call it.
Yeah, that for sure. That's where it comes from. Exactly. That's the source. Cyclonomedia was the source material for that. And I originally wrote a short piece on the 4 elements updated from, say, Empedocles to the present, and borrowing for each element a different kind of model that poses a problem ecologically, semiotically, human, cyborg, post-humanistically for a collection that came out on post-humanism, and that was my sort of focal point. In terms of history of philosophy of ideas, you have these key elements in the pre-Socratics and up until Aristotle in a way, and then you have that hanging around as a model of thought. Dust is beautiful. It's such a rich idea, and it's not even post-natural. It's the way in which liquidity, either blood or oil or gas on water, or gas in the water, or propane or methane in the water, from fracking pollution, that becomes water in our world.
Right.
It's more than bottled water, although bottled water is also in that category now. But you can generate through this process, this renewal of those fundamental elements, a bunch of examples that are provocative. And certainly earth, dust, traces of dust, various dust being blown either from deserts, having different qualities and different colors and different effects, and the way in which the air is perfused with particles, so that air changes, and then you have the Sloterdijk, the atmoterror element entering into it. But the dust is like smart dust. What would smart dust be? There was an idea that I was playing around with in that book, that you can think about a kind of particulate, semioparticulates that could be given a kind of intelligence and, in a sense, mobilized or become autopoetically directed into a kind of cluster of, these sort of techno objects.
Right.
And that's not too far from reality these days. So you get this sort of shift from the organic to the post-organic, from the, the sort of machining of the dust becomes more and more pronounced. If you think about, all of the dead skin under our desks and all of the metal shavings from our bicycles and and the plastic shards embedded in our skin and all through our bodies, you get this whole sense that the world of dust is magnificent and terrible at the same time.
It reminded me this notion of the particle sign dust.
Yeah,
the semiodust, as you call it. What I really enjoyed was you linking it to Guattari's notion of the Machinic phylum or the mechanosphere, which kind of suffuses the biosphere. And that made very palpable for me why and what you were trying to do with following this idea around, because I think that is implicated in this notion of the mechanosphere and in the notion of, which I suppose the Machinic phylum, and they're not the same thing, but the future of robotics or nanotechnology, it's all very close on the horizon.
Yeah, the nanobot revolution. In a way, I just wanted to evoke this very contemporary idea that we are shrouded in particle signs, and we are saturated, immersed in them everywhere we move, every time we move, in environments in which our walls and our furniture are shedding. We're shedding constantly. Everything around us sheds all of these micro fibers and so forth. And I wanted to get that real sense of, when he talks about Machinic phylum, that this is the kind of phylum that we have to begin to think about at the molecular level, that what we've got, that we are in this soup of semioparticles.
That's a great image.
Say we were boiled in this soup every day.
Like a gumbo, huh?
Yeah, like a gumbo, exactly.
A good roux.
Cooper, did you have any questions related to psychoanalysis? I don't want to hog Gary.
Cooper was suggesting something about Lacan. This is a very complicated subject. It could take us hours to figure this out.
That's true.
It's very complicated. Let me just say one thing. If you are an analysand of Jacques Lacan and you are a pain in the ass, essentially, that you're not cooperative, you're not buying it, you were kind of restless, you have your own intellectual project, you're doing all the things you're not supposed to do with regard to your analyst. are you at all surprised that it ends badly, the relationship? And yet he wants to respect intellectually the accomplishments of Lacan, theoretical accomplishments which stay with him his entire life. It's not as if he suddenly resigns from the school or sort of gives up that heritage. It's rather that he becomes annoyed at the very idea of a school, and he becomes resistant to it. And he says, oh, instead, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to treat Lacan like I treat Mauss, like I treat James-Lev, and I'm going to borrow things that I like and recalibrate them and put them to work in my own theory. And so that's how you get very early on the insertion of the machine into structure.
Right.
Mhm.
This begins to not disable, but to disorient structure, to make it shake and to wobble. And so that he can, in a sense, pull it all the way out the other end, having gone through that process, and end up with a kind of Lacanian machinism.
It does seem like the break with Lacan was already baked into the mix with, the way you begin your critical introduction. You paint the picture of Guattari's idea of analysis is not really, on very few points is convergent with a private practice. This notion of an institutional matrix with the grid, with transversality. It's surprising he stayed with him for as long as he did and was that influenced by him. But
devotion, there's an homage, and there's devotion, and then there's the sort of indifference, there's a restlessness. There's a lot of factors at work. But I think that if we just think of Anti-Oedipus as a kind of anti-psychoanalytic book or an anti-Lacan book, we're just wrong to do so. And there's a lot of very interesting statements about what Lacan got right in Anti-Oedipus. And even the castration complex, even these ideas like of Freud's, they survive in Guattari, and he constantly comes back to them. Dream interpretation. It's extraordinary when you read some of those pieces that he wrote later on. We don't really know, we don't have a case study, dossier of case studies, right? So that we can say, oh, there's a few examples here and there that Guattari published, where he's, gives some very interesting examples of some patients that he was dealing with. But we don't have in the spirit of Freud those kinds of case studies.
It wasn't the genre that he necessarily invested in.
He did not strongly believe in that kind of narrative.
Right.
Narrativization of the analytic encounter. But his interest was in the reorganization of an institution and its enactment in a kind of ongoing process was much more important.
Right, that already breaks the genre of the case history and
that already explodes it. Completely explodes it. And you look at a document like the grid and all of the different variations that there were of the grid, all the different ways of drawing the grid and the way in which he analyzed some of the problems that arose. This is his main contribution to psychotherapy, the running of the clinic and the analysis embedded in the running of the clinic.
Right.
The generative, the world that was going to be subject to analysis is going to be generated through that process and not imposed by the superego therapists, the superegos of the therapists who were just imposing their theoretical positions. Very different. And so in a way, he's always trying to look in therapy for examples. And this is Moni Al-Qaim. He really likes, he thinks he likes family therapy, but he mostly likes the idea of the machine and the family therapy, and the same way in which he likes to use a portable cassette tape recorder in his own therapeutic encounters, the way Moni Al-Qaim used videotape to tape sessions and to review the sessions. So he's always looking for these examples that he can use to help along the way. And performances at La Borde, and this whole world of art and performance, and all the creation of a new language and the creation of new different groups, and the way in which groups are organized and the way in which they break down and the way in which they have to be supplemented, and resistances from various forces, internal and external, that they have to deal with.
I like the notion you brought up of introducing these machines into the therapeutic session, because they have the famous footnote in Anti-Oedipus about the doctor who's calling the police on the Alexander who brings the tape recorder in. but even in Freud, he suggests in his kind of papers on technique that the therapist, insofar as it's the one-to-one setting, the therapist shouldn't be even taking notes, shouldn't even be writing anything down, because you have to have that suspended attention, right? You have to have that evenly suspended attention.
Evenly floating attention, precisely. Right. Like the still surface of a mirror, which is, of course, not at all the case. Even in the Freudian encounter, you imagine his dog sitting there in the encounter, snuffling, maybe like, rolling over, wandering in and out. It's like today on Zoom, you see people's cats coming in and out of the picture, and, partners and children, birds and whatnot coming by, things falling from the sky. It's the same with the Freudian encounters, that the chow chows are there and they're poking around and maybe snarling a bit. They're hungry, they have to take a piss, Right. It's a world. It's what happens when you try to do things at home.
And Freud's writing desk with all of the
with all the totems and
oh my god.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is overdetermined.
Yes.
Completely.
It's a theatrical stage, right? Yeah. I mean, in a certain way, it's
it is a theater of the analysis. It has also got these animals involved and his partners coming, shuffling about, and his daughter, and this a family. Because of my philosophical training, I've been obsessed for a very long time with the status of phenomenology in Guattari. And this is for me an ongoing puzzle. And someone who, was trained in the 3 H's tradition of philosophical history, I always gravitate towards a mention in these thinkers of, we're doing something different than phenomenology did. And then I see, okay, I can accept that to a certain extent. And then I see it creeping back in. And in Guattari, it's in chiasmosis, where phenomenology creeps back in. And he has some very, he's obviously not interested in Heideggerian concepts of the ontological difference. He's not interested in that. He is interested in some version of intentionality. Okay? So how he does this is extraordinary. So that's one of my concerns, is that how in the world can he reintegrate intentionality at the very moment when he says we are displacing or decentering the subject? Wow, that's very interesting, because he says we're going to take the subject-object relation in the middle. And so intentionality is not hung back on the subject, it's loosened and floating, and it adheres to non-subjective objectities and subjectities, as you would say. It adheres to this other, an intentionality of the invisible, an intentionality of the proto-enunciative object. So to me, wow, this is really a really strange idea and powerful, hard to get at. So I'm working on that. And of course, I have my other easy answers. It's all just phenomenological psychiatry. It's all von Weizsäcker and the other, Germans that he really liked to borrow from in that not very much studied tradition of phenomenological psychiatry. And that's where you get the pathic idea of the pathic versus the ontic in his work. And there's a whole, I go into great detail about this somewhere, I can't remember where, and trying to study that. And there's not that many good English translations of von Weizsäcker and some of these other key thinkers he's borrowing from in that tradition. But that's another way it survives. And it's fairly implicit. There's not much to go on. The other thing I'm interested in now is, I've always been interested in Japanese, Guattari's fascination with Japan. And from the very beginning, when I started to work on the archives, I pulled out everything I could find on Japan. And I wrote that chapter in the Aberrant introduction on Japanese singularity, and some of the ideas that were current then when he was trying to make sense of his own experiences in Japan, but also some of the features of Japanese culture that he could access through his multiple visits there, especially through the 1980s. And in particular, for me, that was a very important kind of discovery of these almost all minor texts, almost all fascinating fragments, as it were, of him trying to make sense of this world that he's entered into in a very privileged way, by the way, as a guest during the economic bubble period, and when he's delivering lectures and traveling around, and it has, in a say, an entourage with him all the time in Tokyo and other places who, he wants to do this. Well, there's always someone to help him and to take him, and there's always an entourage with him. And he's meeting all the intellectuals, and he knows them through his association. A lot of them, performers and so forth, he knows them through his association with the curators of the big Japan show that was at the Pompidou Center in the mid-'80s. So he was plugged into that side of it as well. Sort of creative writers, musicians, fashion people. He knew all of them through that, not only through his visits. So this is a whole universe so today, what I'm thinking is, okay, how do I use Zen to explain chaosmosis? What is the immersion in chaosmic immanence akin to a Zen experience of the collapse of the subject-object distinction and the entering into this non-duality of the world? Because this is precisely what the schizoanalyst does, right? Is plunges into the depths of the patient's psychosis, into the chaotic, but not undifferentiated, and to pull back, to come back with some complexified relationship of some kind. It's that plunging, I think, that can be described as the breaking of the fusion of subject-object world. So I'm trying to use Zen to figure this out, and reading kind of widely in a bunch of different Zenic traditions, and not respecting their differences very well, I admit, but I'm searching for theoretical insights that I can apply to Guattari, because his writing on this is so cryptic. And it's one of those things that fascinates me, the cryptic nature of it, I suppose. And go ahead.
I was just thinking, is this why you helped edit the text on, is it the Machinic Arrows text?
Yes. That's part of it. That's a background text. Jay Hetrick and I did that quite a while ago with Univocal when Drew was still independent. So, that was a kind of culmination of that interest in Japan, trying to get the text together. And, I was certainly helped by a lot of people in Japan, to do that. It wasn't that simple. I think there's probably a few things missing still from that, but we did our best under the circumstances. The other thing about Zen is it's a very complicated system of belief and thought, and it's not easy to adapt it to someone who's so, in a way, idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
So, yet he does say some strange Zen-like things about schizoanalysis. So.
Yeah, like being right on the surface, and go ahead, Cooper.
I know that. So I wanted to go back just briefly to, you mentioned this phenomenology that appears or kind of remains in Guattari's work. And although I know that the Husserlian phenomenology and Hegel, right, are not exactly the same thing, but a thinker that I've been interested in and trying to understand, and I think goes in this direction, would be, believe it or not, Max Stirner. And I think there's something similar to what Guattari he's doing with this idea of the creative nothing. Yeah, the creative nothing is probably the closest concept that they would sort of share. And so I've been trying to figure out how does this work? Maybe some type of transversality. There's a way to sort of patch these sort of concepts together. It's something that I've been sort of obsessed with in the background for a while.
Well, Gary, you end your book with the Great Zero. You end critical semiotics with this elaborating on the Great Zero. Do you think that kind of goes in that direction a little bit?
Z or Zen points? Z or Zen points? Zero or Zen? Yeah. I don't know how it works out. It was obviously, I'd like to end a book. I would like to end my books with some forward-looking problems. I'll come back to them the next time around when I get a chance. The same with this sort of breakthrough I think the breakthrough in the analysis of Guattari text that came with the understanding of the role of animism in his thought. I'm trying to follow that up now with some work on magic. There are a few passages here and there where he says, well, we do need magic. It's a better alternative in some respects than science or scientificity. It helps. It's very useful for expanding the interpretive field of schizoanalysis. He doesn't elaborate very much on this, but I think by reading through works like Toby Nathan and Isabel Stenger's Doctors and Healers, for instance, gives you a contrast between non-Western and Western science. The displacement of intentionality, the role of the spell object, and the displacement of the individual from the symptoms. The symptom is no longer an individual thing, right? It's that split. We don't study, this non-Western approach doesn't keep those two things together, the symptom and the person. There's a lot going in Guattari, and this is in schizoanalytic cartographies, where he's trying to work out what alternative pathways exist. Traditional medicine. Traditional medicine, he says, this could be just as valuable for our form of analysis than anything else. But he never really elaborates. What kind of magic are we talking about? What kind of traditional medicine? Of course, we have to imagine or find examples ourselves of these ideas and see how they work in a kind of schizoanalytic framework.
I could definitely see something like sigil magic being something he would be interesting, because that's kind of like an asignification or some type of machinic process going on there as well.
It's very suggestive. It's very suggestive. There's a number of different routes that could be taken. I'm trying to just read histories of magic at the moment and trying to understand exactly the bifurcations in the status of magic.
Interesting.
I mean, he thinks that there's a little bit of magic still still inside of science, and a lot of the way in which scientificity is staged. So he believes that all we have to do is just kind of bring it out into the foreground. It will help us to understand how we deal with, in a psychotherapeutic therapeutic context, what role it could possibly play. So those are the things. Zen, magic, those are my...
You're studying to be a wizard, Gary. You're studying to be a wizard.
Well,
yeah.
The notion of sigil magic, it does seem like the diagrams that Guattari starts to elaborate, especially in schizoanalytic cartographies. They become more and more elaborate. They have a kind of magic to them.
Man, you just blew my mind.
Well, you're the one that suggested it.
God, that's fantastic. I didn't make that diagrammatics connection that you just made. That's fantastic.
The diagrammatics connection is very significant.
Oh, that's good.
I thought, when I look back at a very ambitious book like the Aberrant Introduction, with sprawling footnotes, outrageous, 6 pages long, that's just foolish in a way, just to even attempt it. I mean, of course, I was furious. That engagement was so intense at the time. But when I look at my fledgling attempts to explain, even to give an overview of the diagrammatics, the complexity of those diagrammatics, I think I made some inroads in terms of the theoretical foundations that were necessary to approach the problem and to reference some lingering structuralism that I detected in there. I still think there are other ways to do that can be quite constructive. And I think maybe magic is one way, and we haven't really worked out fully the force of the diagram.
That definitely is true, and it does call for more study of those diagrams and putting them in context. I know we have about 5 minutes left. The one thing I wanted to mention in our last session on Anti-Oedipus, I believe it's on ethnology and psychoanalysis. It's section 4, chapter 3. They cite Victor Turner, the Ndembu doctor at work or in practice, I think. And I read that article to put it in context, but they do a good job of schematizing it and summarizing it. They make this claim, but they don't really unpack it because, of course, the last chapter is where schizoanalysis comes up, but they say that what the Ndembu doctor is doing is performing a kind of schizoanalysis where he not only, it's not just a one-to-one relation, the whole village, the whole tribes are brought in and grievances are aired and rites are performed and all of this. So I guess that was the example that I thought of when you brought up.
Absolutely. And that's perfect. That's a perfect example of the contrast between treating individuals or treating groups.
Right.
I mean, that's what the sort of tribal doctor is treating a group, not an individual. And the symptom is loose. The symptom is out there. And it has intentionality has an invisible source. And
it could be witchcraft, right?
Yeah, and it is. And all of those are factors.
Yes.
And this is the kind of thing that Nathan and Stengers do beautifully. The contrast between healers and doctors, between non-Western and Western medicine. That's key to understanding, I think, the approach that they take. And that's why magic, can be brought back in, and animism is important, and non-Western, traditional medicine is also a significant reference point for all of those reasons that are flagged in Anti-Oedipus, but somehow are not elaborated on in a sort of clinical, systematic way, right? We kind of lose that thread, and it appears throughout the Guattari books, just here and there. Because it doesn't appear in the grid when he's describing the grid, for instance. It doesn't really factor in. I mean, he's more concerned with the rhythms and movement of bodies and schedules and how they're posted and how they're interpreted.
Is that a part of it? The refrains and the rhythms that you're bringing up? Is there something that magical in coining
I don't
the
think
refrain?
So. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so.
Is it too ethologically based, or
it's more like organizational? It's
Gotcha.
sort of like it's almost bureaucratic.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a Foucauldian diagram of power, but it's a diagram of, it changes over the decades, of course.
Right.
The diagram changes, the way that it works, the organizational principles change, but it's not about those things. It's not about magic. It's not about other things. It's a bit vexing how he gets those things that I'm interested in anyway, back into the picture, maybe just theoretically.
Do you have a working title? If you want to give us something to look forward to and to imagine and plot little lines of flight, do you have some working titles for some of these works you have?
So I started to write a book on chaosmosis because it's 30 years of chaosmosis in 2022, right? So that is a big year, and the chaosmosmedia.net has been launched in Europe. Chaosmosmedia.net by Anne Carrion and others have been launched. Francois Pan and others have launched this website, and Bifo Berardi is involved and has published his Chaotic Spasm, Chaosmic Spasm on there already. I have my little excerpt from Zen, from my first attempt to understand Zen. I'm going to be editing a special issue of Félix Guattari Studies on 30 years of chaosmosis.
Wow.
Which will come out at the end of next year. And there's a bunch of different essays in there on chaosmosis. But I did start writing a book. And the way I started writing it was that I just would write an essay in response to each chapter in chaosmosis. And so the first one was heavy on the phenomenological material. And the other thing that really interests me, and we don't have time to talk about this, but that in Guattari, think about the World Wide Web circa 1991. 1992. I mean, it's just barely,
right.
I mean, it just barely exists in a way, right? It's just starting out. The concept is fresh, and he's fascinated. He's, I would say, infatuated, in love with the interface, in love with these new ideas, hot links,
right. Yes.
He's so fat, and chaosmosis is full of this fascination. That the way he links things together that's the other thing. Early internet culture is a key foundation for chaosmosis.
Very interesting.
It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary to try to work through the implications of that. So that's how I started. And then I got up to the point, I didn't make too much progress, because then I started to write about Zen and the magic. And that really sent me on a long detour. Nice. So I'll try to get back to it. So maybe that will come.
Work?
This is all one work. This is all one work. One massive
Grimoire
project. It's the final project. I swear, it is the final project on Guattari. I'm not going to write any more books on Guattari. Except this is it.
If there is one thinker maybe you haven't yet written about, Baudrillard, Guattari, these other thinkers, is there someone that you haven't yet, but would like to? That would be my last question.
Oh, that's such a difficult question. I mean, I still think I should have written a book on Marcel Mauss. I should have written a book about the gift, theories of the gift. If I have one regret, it is that. To go back to some of that anthropological material, which I was absolutely in love with.
Yes, I did too.
At various points in my life, and try to work out something.
It's not too late.
And it's never too late.
The Pierre Clusters is one that I've absolutely loved, especially for Guattari.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I agree that there's that material is so incredibly important and rich, and that it really formed for me part of a world that I was just trying to create for myself and for my future during that period of, you know, PhD study, doctoral study, that those books were very, very important for me. Society Against the State and Libidinal Economy and so forth. Some of the other anthropological works. There's Jean-Joseph Gueux wrote a very interesting book during that period about symbolic economies. So there were key books all circling around the anthropological referent.
Well, Gary, we are so thankful that you spent your morning and afternoon with us. Time flies when you're having fun.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed it immensely. And I'm just so glad we got to talk to you today.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we're really not even getting past the surface here, I feel. We've just really started talking about, we haven't really even opened up any of these texts and started to kind of pick through them in a serious way. This is maybe a long-term project we should think about doing.
We would love to.
Absolutely.
We would love to talk to you again.
Yes.
Today. I just enjoyed hearing about your trajectory from the past and into the future. I thought that was illuminating and fascinating. But you know, any one of these texts, especially since we're continuing Anti-Oedipus and Symbolic Exchange of Death, I know that I would want to pick your brain on Baudrillard some more, you know, your dissertation in your first book or your books on Guattari. I mean, we definitely want to have you back on in next year, and we'll keep in touch and we'll talk about it. Also, I still want to talk to you about the seminars and
I know. I want to talk to you about all these things.
Yeah,
so many things. I know. So many things. Keep up the good work. Anyhow, keep up the good work.
I definitely will try to find time because those seminars are fun and and interesting. You've always kind of inspired me to do that, to think about doing. For example, Machinic and Conscious. That was partly, you know, no one else was taking Guattari seriously, at least not in the way in which you were. So you've always been a big source of inspiration for me, and hopefully we'll get to chat again about some of these projects and some of these and your own.
Oh, I hope so. It's great chatting with you. It's fantastic to talk about Guattari.
Yes.
It's always a pleasure. You know, it was very lonely working with Guattari at first.
Well,
you know how lonely it can get.
Right.
Yes.
Because the way in which the Deleuzian scene unfolded very slowly in the early 90s, in at least in the English-speaking world, you know, sort of made it difficult to get a word in edgewise about the other guy.
Right. Everyone loves Deleuze. We know that. But maybe it's Guattari's time. If the 20th century was the Deleuzian century, maybe the 21st will be Guattarian.
Yes. Well, we're already seeing the importance of Guattari every day. You know, Cosmosis is a book of the future.
Yes.
It's a book about the future, right? So.
And that's why Sokal and Brickmont didn't understand.
Well, of course not. I mean, they were not able to understand that. That's obvious.
Or any of the thinkers they really talk about. All right, Gary. Well, we'll let you go. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks,
and
folks.
And we'll keep in touch, and we'll let you know as soon as as the episode comes out.
Excellent.
Absolute pleasure, Gary.
It's a great pleasure talking to both of you.
Thoroughly enjoyed it so much. Thanks again.
Work. Cheers.
Thank you.
We
you as
appreciate
well.
it.
You as well.
Yeah,
Cheers.
we'll be in touch.
Very
Ciao.
rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.